Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Compliance Online live webinar, Japan Regulatory Compliance Requirements for Life Science Products. Our speaker for today is Robert J. Russell, who has been president of RJR Consulting Inc. The company assists the pharmaceutical, medical device, and biotech industries in understanding and complying with international regulation affecting compliance, new product development, manufacturing, and quality assurance.
In Japan, it's rather unique in that there's no singular regulatory organization that's considered a medicines agency. Your license is granted by the Ministry of Health, Labor, and Welfare, and they have many different jobs, and they put in place a branch called the Pharmaceutical and Medical Device Agency under the MHLW. The agency, the PMDA agency, is really the group that does the heavy lifting on your submissions. They've got several pharmaceutical divisions. They've got a couple of biologics divisions, generic products, over-the-counter, also a specific office just for the registration of medical devices. So as I mentioned, foreign manufacturers who intend to export products into Japan, life science products there, have to be legalized, have to be under Japanese law, either through the direct entry or the indirect entry that I just showed on the slides. And this allows products to be marketed when they're granted approval. It also puts you on their business record. It puts you into their income tax system as well for profits made in Japan. I mentioned the simplest form is just a representative office. It's typically one person with maybe an assistant, but these activities that this very, very minor representation can give isn't very much. You can do market research, you can do advertising, but you really can't conduct any real business. You really can't file any kind of significant application or dossier into PMDA, and you're not allowed to, of course, sell anything or generate any profit in the company. So I don't recommend this as a recommended path. If you're going to establish yourself in Japan, you've got to at least do it with a branch office that allows you the ability to interact with the authorities under your own company's name. And the lowest level of that would be simply this, the branch office, where it's got to, you file for the company's registration, they call it the seal. You're entered into their tax system. You have to appoint an official, responsible person from the office. They don't have to be a Japanese citizen, but they've got to be a legal resident of Japan, residing in Japan. And of course, branch offices can earn income. They can remit money back to the parent corporation, and they're subject to taxes only on the amount that the company makes in Japan. And it's actually seen as a good option early on with companies who may experience a loss until they get established in Japan. And you've got a safety controller who's responsible for vigilance reporting both on drugs or devices as it may fit. And they also have to monitor the safety of products that are released in the marketplace to ensure that there are no issues with those products that have been distributed and been sold. Different types of licenses that exist, you'll see there's different classifications of licenses, one for prescription drugs, one for non-prescription, one for quasi-drugs, one for cosmetics, and 3 different types of licenses for medical devices depending on the risk level of device, from specially controlled devices that are high risk all the way down to general medical devices that are low risk. And of course, then there's separate licenses for pharmacies issued as well. One of the things about Japan is they are a member of ICH, the ICH being the International Conference on Harmonization. They are members with the United States and with Europe. So Japan is one of those countries, while foreign to many people, it's not foreign as it relates to common principles that the U.S. uses and Europe uses as well, because being the three triumvirate members, they get together on a regular basis and try to use best practices between each other in their countries. Also, they all have to be compliant to the guidelines put out by ICH. So ICH GCP, ICH GMP, GLP, you're going to see them to be very, very similar, especially between these three regions of the world. So that really does help a lot when you're getting set up to run a clinical trial. You know what to expect. When you're getting set up to have a GMP inspection, you know what you have to comply to, and it works quite well. So an application going into Japan for clinical trials is known as a clinical trial plan notification. It's equivalent to an IND with FDA in the United States. And of course, the majority of times, whether if you're a biologic or a drug, they're going to require a Japanese subset of population. If you're a medical device, they may not. So don't assume you've got to redo a trial if you've got it done on your devices, if there's no reason why it should behave any differently with a Japanese subset of population than any place else where trials may have been run. Again, they're looking for things that would have a therapeutic effect based upon body size, body weight, diet of the Japanese people, which is why they many times require at least a bridging study be done in Japan. But of course, for many medical devices to prove safety and efficacy, that will not be the case. And so don't assume you've got to rerun any clinical studies in Japan for medical devices. But certainly it's a checkpoint along the way that we do for our clients. So the sponsor files a clinical trial notification. Is a 30-day waiting period for PMDA to review the application, get the IRB review done, and to be able to then respond back to the sponsor on the study if they believe they have any concerns or questions on it before the trial is allowed to begin. The components of the clinical trial plan notification is what you see here. You'll have to give them the information on the type of the trial, the products involved, the name of the manufacturer, the name and information on the sponsor, the intended indications, whether you're a drug device, the trial plan outline, what you're looking to prove, the name of the institutions involved, the name of the investigators involved, how much product you'll be bringing into the country to be able to conduct the trial, because this is linked into the import permit for product entering Japan in support of clinical studies, because there have been no licensing done yet. And these are the major pieces that have to comprise that clinical trial notification application. GCP principles must be closely adhered to. They definitely do a lot of GCP audits, PMDA does, on the IRBs in support of dossier requests being done into PMDA for products to be marketed in Japan. Preclinical clinical data is also checked. They will go through the trial master files with a fine-tooth comb and then making sure, obviously, about the GMP aspects of the investigational products that have been imported to Japan. Japan has an interesting way of looking at risk. Weighing risk versus benefit is one of the things they probably do better than most countries around the world. And their basically philosophy is that you can never completely prevent risk in our business, but you can continually try to minimize it. So they see the minimalization working from non-clinical knowledge to clinical knowledge to review of the dossier to post-marketing experience in the marketing of the drug or biologic to the masses. And of course, they believe you move from unknown risks to known risks. There's still risks, but they're much more known risk in having gone through the various development phases for that drug or biologic. Then, of course, the social relief system is in place to assist any subjects that have been adversely affected by products that would be licensed in the country. And this is just what I was talking about, the movement from known risks away from unknown risks, and just what happens as products move through the natural development cycle, working their way towards a license approval and marketing in Japan. A little bit on clinical studies for devices. Class 1s, they're not necessary. For Class 2, 3, and 4, they're obviously going to require them more and more as the classification goes up, but most Class 2s in principle are not. Class 3s are sometimes required, and it doesn't necessarily mean you've got to have them on Japanese patient populations. If you've done your studies elsewhere to show efficacy, show safety, for Class 4s, definitely, and like I said, for Class 3, sometimes, depending on that Class 3 device. For clinical trial work, PMDA will require the clinical trial application be submitted, again, the notification 30 days before you intend to start the study, because if they contact you with concerns, you cannot start. If you hear nothing in 30 days, I would still check with them. Don't rely upon their clock and your clock being exactly the same date, because it never works well. All trials that are registered in Japan go on the Japanese Registry of Clinical Trial Studies platform. It's an electronic platform in Japan that gets utilized. CROs typically utilized many times on conducting trials for sponsors, also in the device area. Non-Japanese sponsors are required to appoint a clinical trial sponsor or caretaker, so be it, in the country when the actual sponsor of the trial is ex-Japan. The trials for devices should follow the ethical guidelines for medical and health research involving humans and the Clinical Research Act that was updated back in April of 2018, so just a little more than a year ago. The study criteria also came into effect, where now we will list several guidance documents that can be pulled up, where clinical studies that were required, where efficacy and safety were just not enough to evaluate the performance of the product on subjects. And again, clinical studies being required for the device. In those kind of cases, the PMDA consultation can be made if you've got any questions about this, to determine the necessity and extent of any clinical studies on devices. And so you can have a pre-clinical trial notification meeting with PMDA on devices before you just automatically assume you've got to run the trial. Now, on the marketing authorization process for medical devices, you'll fit a classification of either a new device, where it's a new intended use and indication from any previously approved device in the country, or you'll fit a classification of an improved device, maybe with some modification to one that the agency is familiar with, or a generic device where the two are interchangeable with the agency. So your review for authorization will be based on these three categories of where your device will fit, not only in the classification process, but in the newness to PMDA. As I mentioned, the authorization procedures are very, very similar to that of pharmaceuticals. The company, submits a marketing authorization to PMDA. PMDA reaches out to the MHLW plus their consultancies for comment. Those comments come back in. They give a final report to the Ministry of Health. They review that also with the PAPS Council, and at the end of the day, final recommendation comes back in to either approve or not approve the licensing of the device. The same process is followed as I went through for drugs earlier. So GCP inspections, they have various GLP ordinances, GCP ordinances, which are guidance documents that you want to familiarize yourself. I gave you the listing here. The local governments would do any kind of manufacturing inspection of a local manufacturer or packager from the province's offices if you've got a Class 2 or Class 3. PMDA themselves would most likely get involved with all Class 4s and cell or tissue-containing devices as well. A couple words about cultural aspects in working in Japan. For those of you that have not worked in Japan, you'll find it to be quite different. It is all about building relationships. It is all about consensus building, which is why you'll never get a quick answer from a group to be working with in Japan. If they've not had time to see questions in writing or get questions popped to them at the last minute, it'll be very difficult for them to establish a position, to have discussed enough to establish a position and to give you a cogent answer on something. So they're going to spend a lot of time in the back and forth of Q&A with you. They also are very, very big about assessing applicants or sponsors' integrity and trust. First impressions mean a lot in the country, and like I said, no one's going to move until they're ready to move, done by the consensus process. So it's much, much different than what applicants and sponsors expect from a Western culture. Their view of time is by the event and by the season, not by the day and by the hour. The IP is a little bit of a concern, but Japan's probably one of the best trademarks and patent departments in avoiding protection that we deal with globally. One thing you'll find out about contracts is contracts are loose agreements to conduct business. They're not necessarily fully binding for the full term of the contract. You may sign something in good faith and one party decides later on they've got to renegotiate the terms of the contract. That is very, very common, and it's considered an acceptable practice in Japan. If you run into a dispute with another party, you never want to try to do this via a lawsuit. You'll be seen very negatively in Japan. You want to try to do this through a negotiation or through an arbitration board. There's arbitrators in Japan available for this kind of work, and you want to do it definitely outside of the law and court system if you possibly can get it done that way.